G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AskTomTech show. I think we're up to episode 11. And today is something a little bit different. We've got Mia here from My Virtual, who does all of our SharePoint stuff for us and our clients. So Mia is a SharePoint expert, not allowed to use the G word. So welcome, Mia. Good to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I thought today, being SharePoint and all, we should go through SharePoint.
Sounds like a plan.
And probably run through, some of the common, whether misconceptions or better ways to use the platform and things like that, because there's a heap of different ways to do the same thing.
There is, and I think there is a real progression of document lifecycle that, there are essentially three types or three ways to store files when you've got your Office 365 license, and knowing which platform to use for what. Is
the go, and then they confuse it as well when they've got different ways to communicate and collaborate. So
Microsoft really didn't get creative when they were talking about names. They've used the same thing for about 5 different terms, 5 different applications. And so, they didn't, you think they would have made something pretty fancy up, their own name, but no.
But just use what's there.
Yeah.
Because they've brought up a few different things, I think, as during that process, because we've ended up with, Yammer fits in there from a collaboration and communication perspective, and they had they pushed groups initially, Outlook and Office groups, which kind of did some stuff and not other stuff, and now we've got Teams.
Which is tied in with all of that.
Which is tied into all that. But I think that's really where it's all focused now. A lot of the focus is around Teams.
That's right.
Okay, cool. And that's good to know, because it is something we get asked a lot is, what do I actually use? I've spun up Teams and I've got stuff in there, and how do I do it? And I think this is probably where we should start, is probably that, let's call it the architecture of a SharePoint and collaborative environment, for lack of a better word. It's probably not as complex as what architecture will sound, but where do we sort of start? And I think that's probably the key.
Yeah, and I think that the word architecture sounds a bit scary, but it's just what it is. It's the hierarchy, I like to call it as well, hierarchy or just the structure. So basically, I think before we get into talking about SharePoint, there's a bit of a progression. So just to touch on it. So OneDrive is for your personal files, okay? It might be called OneDrive for business, but it's still associated to you as a user. So if you're logged in and you put things in your OneDrive, no one else can see them unless you share it.
Specifically share it.
Correct.
So think about it like your My Documents folder.
Perfect, yeah.
Which is now backed up to the cloud to some extent.
Yeah, exactly. It should be a replacement to your My Documents, which is what we're all used to. So that's OneDrive. SharePoint comes after Teams. So the next piece of the puzzle is Teams.
Okay.
And so what I like to say instead of Teams, because there's team sites, there's Microsoft Teams, there's 1,000 uses for the word Teams. So I basically decided that I'll always refer to a Microsoft team as working groups, and then the sites that are associated with when you create a team, I call a working site. So to be clear on this, what happens when you create a team? A few things sort of spin off. One, you get a Office 365 group.
Yep, it'll appear in your global address list as a group. Yep.
And with that, you get a calendar and a mailbox.
Yep.
You also get the chat, the team itself, and then you get a single.
Actually, within Teams, we're gonna flick between, and you'll see this pop up, hopefully. But so we've created a team here.
Yes.
So essentially, there's a Teams client, like an installer that goes onto your computer.
Yes.
And you create your team structure, and then within that, create the different channels.
Correct.
Yeah.
So that is linked to a team site.
Which is SharePoint.
A standalone SharePoint site, okay? A standalone SharePoint site.
So what do you mean by standalone? Like, it's obviously within the framework of your Office tenant still.
Correct.
But
if you're not a member of the team, you don't get to see it.
Okay, yep.
So if you're not a member of the team, you don't get access to those files or to that SharePoint site.
Yep.
So basically, you're in or you're out.
Yep, okay.
So the reason that's important to note, and the reason I say standalone, is because if it's company-wide information, it shouldn't really be going into a team because no one's going to be able to search for it. No one's
so it won't even in your top level, if you are using, once we get to that point, the SharePoint side, none of those team sites are going to...
If you're not a member.
Oh, you won't see the results of the searches
Correct.
and things like that. Yeah, okay.
So if you're not a member of the team, you're kind of being left out. You're not going to get any of the documents.
Yeah, the bits that you need.
So that's why I call them working sites because I feel like they're for functions of the business. They're your everyday sort of...
So what are we typically creating? We'll be creating it around the business structure. So like the different divisions of a business and those type of things. Yep.
Yeah. So and then that takes us to the next part, which is the overall SharePoint structure.
Yep.
So they all match. So you might have a team, a working site, a working group that is working on content. The final content might then get published to a more wider viewed and the main SharePoint hierarchy. So it's still got its structure. It still might be under a site in that main structure called, marketing.
Yep.
But the marketing team are working on other stuff that not everyone else needs to know. But the final stuff, the final templates, the final logos, they all get published.
Yeah, okay.
And when I say that, I mean just moved. To.
Yep.
To
published sounds good though.
It does sound good. Yeah. Move to the main SharePoint site. People can search for it. They can access it and consume that content. So that's the sort of progression.
So we almost do have, as an end result, we will have a SharePoint site which essentially matches a team. Let's say marketing has a SharePoint site and marketing has a team, but the content between them is still separated. And it's just at that top level when we talk SharePoint, that's where we can allow others to view that information it might just be a read-only view, but we can get them into that. Yeah.
That's right. Okay. And I think throughout all of this, the thing I always come back to is think of the audience. Think of your audience. Think of who is using this content. If it's just you, OneDrive. If it's you and a few people, working team. If it's the whole business, it's the main SharePoint site.
Well, that's a really simple way to think about it, and it sort of makes logical sense. Yeah, I like that. And allows you then to build it out, because you can then have different working teams.
Yeah.
And they don't necessarily have to match what's in SharePoint, but at some point, if you want people elsewhere in the business to see it, you move it up there and away you go.
Correct.
Yeah, okay, cool. So we've got teams. So if we have a look then, we've got so this is probably not a great example, but you can have multiple teams floating around here. This is where you create your teams. We've got a chat section. We've got files associated with that particular team.
Yeah.
Wiki planners, all sorts of stuff like that. So it's a central point where everyone can work and get around and find the stuff that they need to do today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I see it really as a roll-up of all of the different items. So Teams is where it's at, basically. It's just, everything still serves a purpose. SharePoint is still, the baseline for all this stuff. You still need to store your documents somewhere, and they still need to be, reviewed and accessed by certain members at certain times.
So we're talking your final document, your policies, your procedures. It might be, I know we use it extensively for client documentation, all those sorts of things. Even proposals and all that eventually end up in SharePoint, so the rest of the business can see what we're doing. So
that's right.
Okay.
I think one of the things just to be mindful of with all of this is Microsoft have made it very easy to create these, which is great, but it's also a detriment at times because I've done audits recently where we've seen 200 plus teams,
which is just a nightmare to manage.
And you know what? About 60 of them were all replicated. So they all had the same name. So admittedly, Microsoft have fixed it where you can actually search for teams now.
Yep.
So there is some best practices around teams.
They've also allowed us to, at an administrative level, control the naming conventions.
Yes.
There's functions around there we can set up so they will be named in a certain way as well.
Yeah.
And I think even at an administrator level, we can set it to block the creation of teams.
I was just going to say.
And we go through a workflow process to create them.
That's what I was going to say. It is a bit more complex to set up, but I highly recommend it for businesses that have got a lot of people that are keen to give things a go. Because you'll find, it'll go 0 to 100 pretty quickly.
Well, and then you end up in a world of hurt because you've got data everywhere, and then no one knows what they're looking for anyway, and they don't know what team they're a member of, or then they get confused about where they should be saving it. So,
and you definitely need a process. You need a business process for this, and I think you just need to be mindful of that going into it. You know, especially if you're a business owner, you need to make sure that you know, you've got some solid processes around and expectations around the way you want people
what you want it to look like.
Yeah.
So okay. So remembering, OneDrive is your personal repository. Consider it your My Documents. Teams, well, it's Microsoft Teams, but we refer to as working teams. Is for that effect, your team or the group of people that you're working with to collaborate on documents you're working on or content you're building. And then SharePoint, which is the end result, where that final piece of data will get moved to make it accessible for the rest of the business. And generally what we're seeing as well is obviously we'll have Teams as a client which will launch and people will work within their day-to-day, but then they have their SharePoint which looks like this, where that's what they're opening when they first start their browser and things like that. So they've got a point of reference to then get access to everything. And that's where the SharePoint element starts to come together.
That's right.
So this allows them to do things like, what's this, Yammer, which is a news feed. Welcome.
Hey, Tom.
Calendar events, so we can then start bringing the business together and what's happening in events, and it's centralised, and then start publishing what those key documents are and all sorts of stuff like that. So there's sort of any number of things you can do on it.
That's right.
And as we see across the top here, we've got, this is the business unit structure effectively. So how we want to position this and show this to the rest of the business.
So the way I break it down for people to understand, used to a traditional file server, is that if you opened a drive, a G drive for example, and you had a look at a tidy G drive, by the way.
Do they exist? I don't think so. Not sure.
But you open the G drive and the first level of folders that you see, it tends to be like, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 or more.
Your business units, finance, marketing, sales.
So
whatever.
they're your sites, and so I liken them to getting a phone. You have you get a phone. It's got a few apps on it. It's got some functionality, but we tend to go into the app store and we get a bunch of apps that, you know, make it more functional for us, shall we say. So each of these business units has the ability to do the same thing. So you create these sites. They're an empty, you know, space that people can fill up with whatever they want. So the basic app is called a document library. So that's the most commonly used one. And as the name implies, it's where the documents are stored. So if we hover over...
have a look in here and we go to our marketing document library. Which really is, it's literally just a folder with files in it.
Correct. So that's what the next level is it that you hover over marketing, so that's your first level in the file structure. You double click, what do you see? You might see 4 or 5 other folders. So if you look on the screen, you've got images, marketing and website. They're 3 libraries.
So they're 3 separate libraries, which looks like a folder structure.
So that's the next. And then inside those is where you put the additional folders and files. So the idea is, well, it's very similar. It's just visually different.
And look, it can take a little bit of getting used to, and it is one thing that we come up against a lot is, I really like my G drive, and I like how quickly it is. We're no longer accessing it via Windows, and I think that's probably the benefit of this, because now we can actually make this data accessible anywhere.
Correct.
And we don't have to rely on a server that used to sit in the corner of our office, and we could only access that data if we were in our office, logged into our PC.
And if, you know, the network went down, everyone was done.
So it is a true cloud. It's almost like a cloud file server, obviously driven out of a browser. That's sort of the key element.
That's it. It's a big behavioural change. It seems simple, but it is a big change for those that are used to the server. But you know, it's just what we, you know, need to all get used to. It's going to be the only way we access stuff in the next 5 to 10 years.
And you're right, because it's where everything's going. I mean, you look at where we're seeing a lot more mobile devices, laptops and tablets and mobile phones, and they're outstripping the PC market from a supply perspective, because people want to be mobile and they want to access their information wherever they are.
Yeah.
And that's where the key element comes in with the Teams and the SharePoint and the OneDrive, is about making that data accessible to anyone. Obviously, there's security implications, and that's another topic of conversation. But I think being able
keep watching for next week.
I like the plug. Yes, we'll do that one. But that's sort of it. It is a change. People need to accept that this is where we need to move to for a whole lot of reasons.
Yeah.
It's not just because it's easy to get access to, but we can bring the business together more effectively by giving them access to information, visibility to information, and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, I think we're creatures of habit, so there's always going to be resistance with change, because we want to we want the path of least resistance, and we want to know that we can do something. We don't like to feel inadequate or out of our depth. So there's always going to be pushback. There's always going to be people sort of not comfortable with it, but be persistent, stay with it, and just give it a go. That's the best advice. It seems simple, but just give it a go, because, as I say, there's not going to be a lot of support for any other option soon. And I think that, once you get familiar with it, it will become second nature, and then it will be the path of least resistance for you.
And I think it is, and we've seen that plenty of times where there's a bit of backwards and forwards and argy-bargy about, no, that's not going to work, it's not going to deliver what we want. Look, there's always a way to deliver it. And we know in certain industries you're going to have stuff that, quite frankly, can't go into SharePoint.
Correct.
Particularly in building and construction and those type of things where they've got, or even some of the marketing department with their big InDesign files and AutoCAD files. Those things simply aren't going to go into SharePoint. So there are other things that need to be considered, and you're going to maintain an element of local storage, whether it is a local server or a NAS or something, depending on the organisation.
But that's the key. You can strip everything else out, put it up in the cloud, and then reduce your costs with minimising the access to just the people that are using those big files, because everyone else in the business consumes it at its end result.
Yes, that's right. So, and the marketing department, all they need to do is position the final brochure in a PDF file. Up it goes under the marketing file on SharePoint, and away they go. Right. So, and that's kind of it. And and that's key to understand that workflow of your data within your business as well, because there is always going to be an element of an end result, and there's a working set. And your working set may or may not be in Teams or in SharePoint. It might still be local to some extent, depending on what it is. But when you want to distribute that across the business, when you're talking businesses now that are, you're not just sitting in one office, you've got team everywhere, we've got offshore workers, we've got other states, we've got other countries trying to access the data.
That's it.
Yeah, this is where the benefits really start to come into it. Okay, very cool, very cool. So what I think that was the other aspect, and you touched on it, was that cost factor, because the thing is, this is actually included in your Office 365 license anyway. So we're not talking about another license or another subscription. It's all there. Yeah. You just have to, you have to invest some time and effort and probably some consulting aspect around to get it the way you want it to look and feel. But it's not another subscription.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so.
And the beauty of it is that you don't have to be reliant on a web developer, on someone that knows all this fancy code to continue to evolve it with your business. You can do it yourself. So a bit of training and support.
Yeah, look, and that's it. There's certainly options around for that ongoing support and in ins and outs. And a lot of it is all driven out of a browser. Drag, drop, add this, do that. Yeah. There's not a lot you can break.
That's right.
Just don't delete the pages and stuff, but make sure they're backed up, and we look after all that anyway.
Yeah.
But I think that's really the value, because you're going to have champions within the business, probably for each of your SharePoint sites or your teams, who are going to want to manage an element of that anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
So you train them up.
I think on that too, don't look for the managers to be the champions. You'll find that people will be natural champions or leaders in this. They'll be someone that really enjoys getting their hands dirty with this stuff in each area of the business, and so it might not be the obvious choice of the manager or who you might think. If you engage people and talk to them about what you want to do, you'll find that they'll come forward themselves.
Yep, and start to want to do it. Yeah. And it is, you've got to engage throughout the business to get acceptance on these things. And it's just like any change project or any project you roll out. You need to get that buy-in from the team, and that's where you'll start to see those people who are actually wanting to see this change and wanting to drive that. And it's generally, these things aren't an IT function, and they probably shouldn't be. Yes, there's elements that will be managed by IT at a back end to control elements of it, but once it's there and once it's being used by the business, go for it. Like, that's
absolutely.
We don't want so much IT involvement in that. Yes, we support and manage and those type of things, and there's avenues for the how-tos and whatnot, but we're not relying on now the IT department to go, actually, we need to put more disk in a server, we need to create a new network share and map a drive and roll that out.
And we've all seen what happens when intranets are handed over to IT to manage.
Oh, they don't get managed.
The content dies pretty quickly, and essentially it's next to impossible for people to get content in there. It's too hard. There's too much process. Whereas this is evolving, living, breathing, growing, and changing with the business, and it's easy for people to do.
Yep.
So
great. That's what we want. We want it to be easier, and that's the idea of it all, is to just make it easier, accessible. I'm sure there's other words to put around it, but that'll work for the time being. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All good. Mate, that was really good. So thanks, Mia. Thanks for coming in. There's a lot more to drive into on these things. With SharePoint Teams, we could probably do a whole session on Teams and a whole session on SharePoint, and I'm sure we will sooner or later. So great, thanks for coming, and
thank you.
See you all next time.